Hi, folks. Welcome to this third in our seminar series, the summer series from GW Law School. We're very glad you could join us. We had earlier sessions on July 23rd and July 25th. The one on July 23rd was about international issues, and we really had a really useful discussion focusing on what the best international strategies emerging are in green procurement. And then the second session we had was on some of the international trade issues that come out of these emerging strategies. We'll be talking about those in more depth in just a minute, but welcome to this, our third and final session. The recording from this session will be available on Public Procurement International. It will usually be available in the next couple of hours. And the materials, the background materials, the research we've been drawing on is available in Public Procurement International as well. Today we'll be having both the Q&A and the chat. Usually the Q&A is a better bet for structured questions, but if you have questions that are just informal questions you'd like an answer from the panel, please feel free to use the chat. The chat will become part of the public record from this session. You can see the chat from the earlier sessions on Public Procurement International. And just quickly in terms of the speaker statements, they're in their personal capacity. So as I mentioned in session one, was really about the international experience in sustainable public procurement or green procurement. And what we saw was that among the strategies that are available in sustainable public procurement and environmentally sustainable public procurement, what we saw was that the eco labels are really emerging as a primary strategy, that for institutional reasons, for legal reasons, for enforcement reasons, for a number of different reasons, for cost reasons, the systems are leaning first toward eco labels. And we're using the term eco labels very broadly. Eco labels, we're talking about a particular environmental standard that would apply to a product, say paper. Paper of a certain standard would be considered environmentally sound because the production process creates fewer greenhouse gases. So these eco labels, broadly understood, are these environmental standards that we'll be talking about in more detail today. And as I mentioned before in session two, the use of eco labels, we talked about the fact that the use of eco labels can create international trade issues because sometimes they're discriminatory. If a vendor in one nation or state or government has eco labels that don't match another nation or state or government, then that vendor will have a hard time moving between public procurement markets. So the use of eco labels, while very common now, increasingly common, it can raise international trade issues. And we talked about those in the second session. We also talked about them briefly in an earlier webinar that we had on the joint EU-US compilation of sustainable procurement strategies, and that information is also available on the program page. So just here, I want to see if we could take a quick poll on green procurement strategies, and if the folks who are in the audience could respond to this question about what is the most common strategy in your jurisdictions? In your jurisdiction, obviously, if you're in Alaska, you're also in the United States. But if you're a lawyer from Alaska, for example, your jurisdiction would be Alaska as opposed to the United States. If you could just respond as to what's the most common strategy that you see in your jurisdiction among the 5 that we've identified internationally as in these patterns. And it looks like what we're seeing is that eco labels are leaders, but technical evaluation, this is very interesting. The idea that green procurement issues we brought into, for example, is one product or service more green than another, that would be part of the technical evaluation. We're seeing that, a very strong response there. And thank you very much. I'm going to close out the poll here. And it looks like, in fact, technical evaluation came out front, and planning came out in front as well. That's very, very useful and interesting. In countries, Brazil and the United States, planning processes now are incorporating green procurement considerations. So it's very interesting to see how strong a response we got on that. Interesting too is relatively few responses had to do with contractor qualification. As we've discussed, while contractor qualification makes sense, it's nudging the contractor community towards for instance, chronicling greenhouse gas emissions. It's nudging the marketplace in that direction. The downside of it is that you can end up disrupting a supply chain by disqualifying contractors based on their participation in green procurement. I'm going to go ahead and share the results. And then I'm going to go ahead and move on to the next slide. So there is a framework that we're going to be talking about today. There's a design to this, and we've drawn here from the NASPO State and Local Government Procurement, the Practical Guide. And the Practical Guide, Julia Wolfe was actually heavily involved in drawing and working on the Chapter 15. The Chapter 15 from the NASPO Guide is available on the program page. NASPO very kindly has allowed us to post Chapter 15 there. And at the beginning of that chapter, there is a recognition that there are 4 basic elements to a successful green procurement strategy, sustainable procurement strategy. You have to have a legal mandate, you have to have stakeholder coordination, you have to have a statement of authority of policy, coverage, roles, and waivers, and then there has to be a process for reporting on success. So this is a framework strategy for making green public procurement succeed. And we'll be coming back to this. I wanted to share it with you now because it gives you a way to think about the presentations you're about to hear, drawing on experience both at the state and local level across the United States. So I'm going to go through introductions. Emily Soontornsaratool is going to be talking from Maryland's experience, what it is that she does in Maryland to encourage green public procurement. Cary Watters is going to be talking about her experience from Portland. It's a city level experience, but a very sophisticated green procurement system there. And Julia Wolfe is going to be talking about her work as the Director of Environmental Purchasing in Massachusetts, how it's worked in Massachusetts. And I think each of these is very unique, very interesting. We walked through this as part of our preparations. Each of these is a very unique perspective with a lot of lessons to be learned around the country. So Emily is the Chief of Sustainability at the Maryland Department of General Services, where she leads a statewide green procurement program. She serves as the chair of the Maryland Green Purchasing Committee, an interagency committee to advance sustainable procurement in Maryland state government. She also leads the state's centralized electric vehicle infrastructure program, which supports Maryland's transition to a zero-emission fleet. She's a certified project manual professional by the Project Management Institute and a certified climate change professional by the Association of Climate Change Officers. She's a 2023 graduate of leadership, Baltimore County. Cary Watters is the Sustainable Program Manager for the City of Portland. Sorry, Cary, I had to move my camera here. She previously served as a contract supervisor and contract equity coordinator at the Portland Bureau of Transportation. Before that, she was a founding member and communications specialist with the Portland Clean Energy Initiative. She also worked for several years with the Native American Youth and Family Center in Portland. She has a dual bachelor's degree in environmental sciences and public policy from Evergreen State College and a master in urban and regional planning degree with a specialization in environmental planning from Portland State University. Our third guest is Julia Wolfe. She serves as the Director of Environmental Purchasing in the Commonwealth of Massachusetts. She was previously an environmental analyst and planner with the Massachusetts Department of Environmental Protection. She also served as an environmental planner and waste reduction coordinator in the U.S. EPA. And she has a master's degree in geography, resource management, and environmental planning from San Francisco State, and a BA in French from the University of Wisconsin-Madison. So with that, I'm going to go ahead and turn it over to Emily, and thank you all to all of our panelists for joining us. Emily?
Thank you, Chris. I'm so happy to be here and with such great co-panelists as well. I'm Emily Soontornsaratool, as Chris mentioned. You can just launch into the next slide, and I'm very happy to be talking about our program in the state of Maryland. So our program was actually set up by legislation in 2010. The Green Maryland Act was passed, and that actually set up this interagency green purchasing committee. The committee has a number of mandated statutory members, including budget management, commerce, Department of Education, environment, health, IT. Even includes our University System of Maryland, which is 12 public institutions. And the committee is both chaired and staffed by General Services. So we chair the committee, but we also provide, at this point, 2 full-time staff person in addition to myself, to do the work of the program, which is a statewide program to do a number of things. Importantly, to promote environmentally preferable procurement, which is a mouthful. So we tend to just say green purchasing. To make sure that training and resources are available to state agencies. We develop best practices, guidelines, policies to ensure that green purchasing becomes the default action in Maryland state government. We coordinate, this is important, I know the NASPO guide talks about this as well, with all of the other different entities and initiatives across state government working on parallel initiatives. So, for example, in Maryland, we have a really ambitious climate goal for a 60% greenhouse gas reduction by 2031 and net zero greenhouse gas emissions by 2045. We do have a commission on climate change. We also have similar commissions on clean transportation. So making sure that we're in alignment from the procurement side. Also very important to our program is that we publish environmentally preferable specifications. Those become, actually we publish them online to our website, and they become resources for state agencies to use in their solicitations and contracts. And then we also are required to report annually to the governor and the legislature on our green purchasing activities. And I'll go a little bit deeper into a couple of those. So our program in Maryland is bolstered by statutory and regulatory requirements. So that has helped our program, which is now quite a mature program, be successful in ensuring that green purchasing is followed across state agencies. There are a number of laws in effect related to environment or related to procurement, and our work is really at the intersection of those two. So we follow very closely legislative session every year to see what is going through and how it will affect what we are able to procure in Maryland. And that can be as specific as a prohibition on buying something with a particular chemical, or it can be broader and require commodity-specific requirement for an eco-label, for example, for IT products to have a certain eco-label. But then there are these very general requirements that are very important to the success of the program, which include that Maryland agencies are just generally required to procure environmentally preferable products and services. So that is laid out in Maryland regulation with a few caveats, including if they do not perform adequately, if it would exclude adequate competition, or are not available at a reasonable price in a reasonable period of time. Obviously, that's there's a little bit of nuance to navigate there, and the Green Purchasing Committee helps agencies kind of understand what actually exists in the market and whether any of these caveats are actually necessary to be met. So the other broad one I sort of touched on is the fact that we publish these specifications, and that once the committee publishes specifications, agencies must then use them in their procurements.
So Emily, can I ask a question, and then I want to make a quick observation? So in many systems, for instance, in the federal system, and you see this on the model procurement code as well, you're really trying to set up offices that serve as brains for the procurement system. But these offices don't have any operational control. They're just the brains. They're providing policy and guidance, regulations for the other offices. Is your office kind of like the brains of green procurement in Maryland, or do you have an operational role as well?
So I suppose we're the brains in that we are the subject matter expert. We're the only folks that have dedicated staffing to do this specifically. However, it is very much a collaborative process and requires all of those agencies. I think having an interagency committee where all of these the agencies are members of that committee and have the requirement as a statutory member of that committee, sort of helps share that responsibility. And then in terms of just rolling out operationally, how is it all implemented? We obviously cannot be everywhere all at once, and we cannot do all of the compliance for the state. So we have approached that through a very robust training program, which I can talk about next. I think it's the next slide.
Just wanted to make a quick observation for the audience on, if I could, just go on terms of the legal mandate you have here. So what we're seeing here, Emily, in Maryland is a very, very clear legal mandate. The federal rules that we're seeing emerge on green procurement are largely grounded in executive order, and that leaves them very politically and legally vulnerable. Politically vulnerable because if President Trump were to be reelected, then he would just eliminate those executive orders, so the foundations for those regulations would disappear. Even if Vice President Harris is elected, the fact that you're grounding that the mandate is one in executive order as opposed to a mandate in statute, which is what you have in Maryland, is very, very tricky under the Supreme Court's decision in Loper-Bright. And we had a webinar on this a couple of weeks ago under the Supreme Court's decision in Loper-Bright and the decisions that emerged during the pandemic with the mandate that all contractor employees be vaccinated. Some circuits said an executive order isn't basis enough. You need to have actually a statutory basis for a regulation that addresses a major question like environmental sustainability. So at the federal level, we still need to get our house in order. We need a statutory basis for what you're already doing in Maryland.
Thank you. Yeah, that's great perspective too. Sometimes I look at that statute and wonder, could it be stronger? Could we provide fewer ways to wriggle out of the requirement? But we are very fortunate to have that as a foundation for our program in Maryland. In terms of making sure that Maryland, the folks who do the work of procurement in Maryland are adequately prepared to do green purchasing, we have been working for the past couple of years on making sure that we have a green purchasing literate workforce of procurement professionals. And so we started actually when the state established a Maryland Procurement Academy in 2019. That is a program that all state procurement officers must go through in order to be a working procurement professional in Maryland. Maryland, just generally, this is an aside, and I won't go into it, but does have a lot of procurement layers. There's a lot of laws and regulations. It's a little bit less simple and straightforward, I've been told, than other states. And so there's really a lot for these folks to wrap their heads around to conduct procurement legally and fairly in Maryland. And so there is this academy that they work through. They become certified Maryland procurement officers. And since day one, we made sure that green purchasing 101 is in that mandatory training so that every procurement officer in Maryland will have that. It's about 2.5 hours live training that we give, as well as learning checks, and they have to pass a quiz at the end to make sure that they understand, first of all, the basic requirement of green purchasing, but then also how does it actually work in practice. And then a little later, a few years ago, we launched a voluntary certification that folks can go on to do a deep dive in green purchasing. We started to think here, Chris, your question was, well, how, you can put out this stuff, but then how does it actually go into operation and get implemented? And our thought was, so what if we had green purchasing ambassadors at every state agency? What if it wasn't just 2 of us at DGS to ensure that this is happening across the state? And so we set up this program with the goals of educating procurement officers and providing that deeper understanding of green purchasing, institutionalizing green purchasing as a knowledge base among staff, and then empowering folks to be that subject matter expert at their agency, enabling them to conduct environmentally preferable procurements on their own. So that is a certification program. It's about 10 hours of live training. And we go through everything from eco labels to how to actually green solicitations and contracts step by step, both when we have a specification that the Green Purchasing Committee publishes and when there is not a specification specifically to follow, how to ensure compliance, and then also just basic climate literacy and sustainability terminology that we found is very important for procurement officers, and that they may come into this just not having that foundational knowledge. So to help them get there. Next slide, please. And so also really important to our program is the fact that we're required to report annually. This is, I'm going to be honest, it's a heavy lift. It is not a simple process to gather all of the data for what the state procures. We don't procure everything centrally. And so we have agencies all across the state and, you know, numerous vendors, about $6 billion of annual spend. We certainly can't look at all of it. So we're very strategic in terms of what we were able to look at and gather to quantify that together into a report. And so we are able to look at key statewide contracts, and also there is a requirement that agencies report to us as well on their green purchasing activities. So we take all of that, we get data from vendors, and we are able to see actually what is the impact of what we're doing. And so on the right, here's our fiscal year 2023 impact report. It looks simple, but it actually takes a great deal of work to get to this point, but we find it really valuable to be able to say, as a result of all of this work that all of the procurement officers are doing across the state, what does that actually mean for the citizens of Maryland? So we do quantify using the data we gather, as well as some environmental calculators, to translate impacts in terms of what that means in real life. So for example, as a result of green purchasing, we were able to document cost savings of $5.1 million. We were able to avoid greenhouse gas emissions, the equivalent of taking 31,000 US passenger vehicles off of the road for a year. And on in terms of electricity savings, conserving material and water, avoiding waste, and reducing pollution. So we're proud of this. It's certainly a work in progress. We try to improve it every year, but it does take quite a bit of work to be able to get to that point of reporting out on impacts. And I will be happy to share both the report, which includes our reporting methodology at the end, as well as some other resources on our website in the chat. And that's all I have.
Thanks so much, Emily. So there's a couple questions for you in the Q&A. If you see on the button on the top, those are questions for you specifically. And can I ask you a quick question early? So Maryland is a heavily Democratic state. It's a blue state in the American vernacular. But until recently, the governor was Republican. Larry Hogan is now running for Senate, and he's a pro-business Republican. So while it's a blue state, there's definitely a strong Republican presence and a strong pro-business presence in that side of the house. Do you find that the reporting helps reinforce political support for green procurement?
Absolutely. And I've worked through 3 administrations. So I started under a Democratic governor, and then we had a Republican, actually a quite popular Republican governor for 8 years. And it was very unclear in the beginning, of course, those of us who were not used to being in a Republican administration, what that would look like. And there certainly is some messaging around cost savings, business opportunities that we explored at that time. During that time also, was the pandemic, and that really shifted how we approached everything, because at that point it was like, what is important to us? You know, we're in this emergency situation here, and you know, there's a lot of emergency procurements, and things like green purchasing are kind of falling off as just not critical right now. This might be like something that folks are interested or passionate about, but does that fit into what we need to do as a state right now? And that's when we really got down to work on developing the impact report, and that's what we launched for the first time, those benefit calculations, and took very seriously being able to show that there were cost savings associated with green purchasing. We did a webinar on saving money through green purchasing and the ways that look. So either upfront over total, you know, life cycle cost savings, per use savings, just avoiding additional procurement kind of thing because things last longer, and went through numerous examples of that to kind of show that green purchasing is not this expensive, you know, difficult thing, but that it's actually something that can provide opportunities, encourage small businesses to get into the game, etc. So yes, I think the messaging can certainly be different. I think the impact report and showing cost savings is always going to be helpful, but there are so many costs associated that we also cannot quantify easily, right? What we can show, I think, is important to do so.
Thanks a lot, Emily. This returns us to the externality questions we discussed in the first session. The starting point for all this is externalities, is global warming, and it's difficult to bring that into a political discussion within a particular jurisdiction. But as you point out, they're so important. With that, I'll turn it over to Cary.
Thank you.
Great. Thank you so much. So my name is Cary Watters. I use she, her pronouns, and I serve as Sustainable Procurement Program Manager with the City of Portland, Oregon. So to start, I want to share briefly about my history before coming on board in my current role. So we'll shift to the next slide around the Just Transition Strategic Framework as a backdrop for this conversation. I'm not sure if I can advance the slides.
No, but just a sec. There we go. I'm so sorry, Cary.
No
Technically
worries.
incompetent.
No worries. Thank you so much. So, you know, as was mentioned briefly in my intro, before I joined the City of Portland, most recently in 2018, I spent several years with the Native American Youth and Family Center. I myself am a member of the Tlingit tribe, which is from Southeast Alaska, but I grew up in the Portland urban Indian community. And I had the opportunity to ground my analysis in the Just Transition Strategic Framework, alongside some of my colleagues from the Coalition of Communities of Color and several member organizations. And through this series, we built our understanding around the fact that eco means home. So ecology means knowledge of home, and economy means management of home. And so we need a holistic shift from our current extractive economy to a regenerative one. And this isn't just about how we manage our environmental resources, but also how we treat one another, how we articulate our purpose, worldview, and governance structure of our desired future. So our Climate Justice Collaborative acknowledged that those living on the front lines of climate change, impacted first and worst, should be the ones driving the solutions for climate resilience through strategies focused on adaptation to our new normal, mitigation of the existing impacts, and to build social resilience. And this led to the development of the Portland Clean Energy Fund, a 1% tax on billionaire retail corporations that make over $1 billion nationally and over 500,000 locally within the city of Portland on an annual basis. And this now provides over $50 million annually for grant making to community-based organizations to build the capacity of those frontline communities to participate in our emerging green economy. So 1 week after Election Day in November 2018, I came on board as Contract Equity Coordinator with the Portland Bureau of Transportation. And then I worked as Contract Supervisor from 2021 onward until I came on board in this role as Sustainable Procurement Program Manager for the entire city of Portland just over a year ago. But during my time with the Bureau of Transportation, I became familiar with our sustainable procurement requirements and the tensions faced as project managers want to get their projects through quickly and cost effectively. And as I encourage them to take that life cycle cost perspective and to ensure that our spend is not focused on immediate value alone, but to ensure that it's in alignment with our values. Next slide, please. So I'll spend a little bit of time chatting about our sustainable procurement policy, because what we spend our public dollars on and who we spend that money with is an extension of what the city values, the kind of world that we want to support for our community and for future generations. So our strategic program supports and advances a best value approach to public procurement, environmental stewardship, equity, labor and human rights, human health, and fiscal responsibility through holistic life cycle costing. We recognize that some of our largest impacts occur within the supply chain, and our sustainable procurement policy can be found via the link on this slide. And it is also accompanied by our green building policy, our goods and services code, and our standard construction specifications. And within our sustainable procurement policy, which I'll focus on here, we acknowledge that our products and services that we purchase have inherent impacts for better or for worse. These are environmental, economic, social, and health impacts. And they happen throughout the life cycle and associated supply chains. So our sustainable procurement policy calls for all city employees to leverage our procurements and purchasing to reduce those adverse impacts and to influence positive change. Especially within our resource-constrained environment, it can be very easy to view sustainability as an afterthought or as a nice-to-have rather than need-to-have element of our purchasing. So rather than considering the upfront cost efficiencies first and foremost, we're called to account for this comprehensive suite of costs and impacts. And all city staff engaged in procurement processes are called to utilize our guiding principles, which are as follows: that everything is connected. We need to conserve, we need to think in 3D, taking into account the ethical, environmental, and social impacts of our purchases, take that life cycle cost perspective, provide fair opportunities, ensure health and safety, uphold accountability, support innovation, provide full integration, and to lead the way. And there are 4 sustainable procurement practice priority areas, including reduction of greenhouse gases, prevention or otherwise reduction of exposure to substances of very high concern, to foster and integrate supplier diversity, and to support safe and fair labor practices and ethical behavior throughout the supply chain. So all city staff are encouraged to follow these best practices related to those priority areas. There's an extensive array of best practices outlined in the policy. So for time's sake, I'll just direct folks to check those out on your own time. Next slide, please.
And Cary, can I just throw something in here? Is that okay?
Sure. Please do.
So a lot of our audience members are from Europe, and they're going to be looking at what your presentation. They're going to say, holy cow, what Portland's doing is exactly what we're used to doing in Europe, where we deal with sustainability as tripartite, as issues not only of environmental sustainability, but also economic sustainability and issues of social justice. And Cary's described something where she's doing all 3, and yet when we hear from the folks, and just as a sort of social realities, they hear from Washington first, just because it's like the highest radio tower, whatever it is. So they'll say, well, when we talk to Washington about national politics and national policies, it's all about only environmental sustainability. Why is it that Cary's talking about all 3 at the federal level? When they talk about sustainability, it's only environmental sustainability. And just for our audience, just so they understand, that was a political decision that was really made during the Obama administration. The Obama administration decided, they're talking about sustainability, to push to one side issues of social justice, issues of economic sustainability, which are addressed in the federal procurement regime, but not under the umbrella of sustainability. For instance, economic sustainability is dealt with through domestic preferences, but they're dealt with differently because the environmental sustainability initiative in the Obama administration foresaw that they might be replaced by a conservative Republican administration. administration. They didn't want the social justice initiatives and the economic and sustainability initiatives to be touched by an attack, which is what happened in the Trump administration, an attack on environmental sustainability. And that's why at the federal level, you only hear environmental sustainability dealt with in isolation, where, as you're describing very eloquently, Cary, at Portland, you're dealing with all three at the same time.
Thank you so much for providing that context. We'll shift to the next slide, please. So our sustainable procurement program at the City of Portland has been in operation for just over 2 decades in some form or another, starting first with the basics of using recycled products in our office supplies and paper, for example. But in 2016, we commissioned a sustainable supply analysis, which provided us with insights about where our actions would have the greatest impact. And this revealed that our supply chain related greenhouse gas emissions are 4 times greater than our operation-based greenhouse gas emissions. And the study analyzed the environmental performance of our supply chain through an impact spend analysis for fiscal year 2014 through 15. This encompassed over 160,000 lines of spend data, covering over 8,000 suppliers and $385 million of spend. So while this data is just about a decade old, it's unlikely that these key takeaways have changed much today, and these findings inform the direction of the program in subsequent years, which told us that we should primarily focus on the reduction of greenhouse gas emissions in terms of our environmental impacts, which accounted for 73% of our total environmental impact. And secondly, that toxic releases came in at 23%, which comprised a combined 96% of our weighted environmental impact. And furthermore, these impacts mainly stem from purchases in construction, miscellaneous services like utilities, and automotive vehicles and equipment. Next slide, please.
Okay, can I just ask a quick question? So what you're saying is the annual reporting that Emily talked about and NASPA talked about, the annual reporting that you're doing actually causes you to make management decisions and to redirect your efforts.
Exactly. And this happened nearly 10 years ago, and the reporting now is based on best available data and is a bit more piecemeal than what we see here, but we know that these truths still stand today and have informed the strategic direction of our program since. So how we do it, as I mentioned, as a result of that analysis, we revamped the program, or I should say my predecessor revamped the program to be more strategic and impactful, and developed this suite of employee on-demand resources and tools like cut and paste specifications, evaluation criteria, training modules, and topic-specific guides. So this also included an in-depth resource page and database on eco-labels, eco-label types, including type 1, which provides that seal of approval for meeting a multiple attribute set of predetermined requirements for a standard, type 2 for verifiable single attribute environmental claims, and type 3, that is environmental product declarations that display that comprehensive and detailed environmental product information, very much like a nutrition fact label for an environmental standard. So program staff develop and manage high impact, high value initiatives to address key procurement related environmental and social impacts. One example includes our highly successful low carbon concrete pilot initiative, which includes those type 3 eco labels, aka the environmental product declarations, on all of our concrete mixes within construction projects that meet that certain threshold. Another example is our regional Clean Air Construction Collaborative of public agencies that the City of Portland convenes to ensure that our diesel particulate matter emissions are reduced on our construction projects from our equipment subject to our standard through a review of all of the equipment to ensure that they're in compliance and an issuance of decals. We also have a consulting contract with a nonprofit organization to support connecting our bureaus to responsibly sourced wood. And outside of the construction side, we've got lots of other highlights, but for the sake of time, I'll just briefly mention that we have a code of conduct for our apparel manufacturers to ensure sweat-free labor. And finally, our labor peace agreement to ensure that contractors providing a certain set of services do not union bust if their employees want to organize. Finally, we provide ad hoc support via review of our requisitions as they come through for procurement processes. And I encourage our staff to reach out to me as early as possible, both our buyers at the bureau level and centralized within central procurement services and our project managers to consult with me about what sustainable procurement looks like within their specific projects. And that wraps it up for me.
So Gary, just a couple questions on this. So, and the World Bank revised their procurement approach in 2016 to focus on risk. And so they streamlined it to make it more strategic, to use the same word that you used. Is it fair to say that you've revised the program, Portland's revised the program to focus more on the higher risk areas, the higher impact areas?
Exactly. We wanted to understand where we would get that best bang for our buck. And of course, eco labels can be so helpful in predetermining those standards because we currently only have a staff of 2. So we have to be very strategic about where we're directing our time and resources, and to lean on those standards to the greatest extent possible. But to figure out, where that highest risk lies, which we found to be within our construction sector.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
So Julia, I'll hand it over to you.
Thank you. Very nice. Thank you very much. And thanks for having me on. So I just wanted to say that I've been working with OSD for the last 12 years or so. And when I took this job, I knew nothing about procurement. And I always tell everybody that I was so surprised by how incredibly complicated it is. And then I realized that we have a lot of power, especially as public purchasers, to use the procurement process to signal change on environmental and climate preferable products and services. And of course, with the goal of ultimately changing, sometimes a little slowly, the marketplace. So I'm going to go over in my presentation a little bit about the EPP program, talk about the regulations, policies, executive orders, how we integrate things into our EPP, into our program. And I'm going to talk a little bit about third-party certifications and eco labels. And then lastly, dive into EPP reporting, which is a big part of what we do. So just a bit about OSD. Our agency, we set up master agreements for goods and services that public entities can use. So we don't buy anything except for what we need in our own agency and offices. And we also don't do construction. So that's the responsibility of another state agency. Executive agencies in the Commonwealth, they're required to use statewide contracts. And so that's our confirmed buying power. So the other eligible entities listed on this slide, they're not required to use statewide contracts, but many do because we've done all the bidding work. We've developed the specs, including the environmentally preferable ones. We manage the contracts, so they don't have to do it. So it really saves them a lot of time. So the EPP program, we actually started in 1994. We have a fairly mature program, and just last year, for the first time, we were able to hire 3 additional staff, 1 to help me, and the other 2 to help build our climate program in our procurement program. So we just became the climate and sustainability unit. So it's really exciting for us to foray into this. Next slide, please. So I just wanted to show you some of the existing regulations and policies, executive orders that help us guide environmental and climate work. They're all really important, but I'm actually just going to focus in on Executive Order 515. And the EPP program administers this executive order out of OSD. So this executive order, it actually provides us the ability to set minimum environmental standards for products and services. We also co-chair the Toxic Reduction Task Force, who helps us identify less toxic products for our contracts. And then the executive order also requires us to complete an annual progress report. that goes to the governor. So we work really closely with many of our sister agencies and departments. And we're trying to figure out what they need. What products and services do you need to make sure that you're complying with Executive Order 515? So Massachusetts was one of the first few states that added a climate position in our governor's cabinet. So Governor Maura Healey appointed Melissa Hoffer to this position, and Climate Chief Hoffer has been working closely with OSD's Procurement Program on Climate, and she wrote on the slide in her recommendations to the Commonwealth that by signaling greater attention to emission reduction and procurement, we can drive more climate responsible decision making throughout the economy. So, along with the new climate staff at OSD, we're really trying to figure out how to collect post-award climate reporting from our vendors. We're also thinking a lot about the social cost of carbon and how do we integrate that in. And eventually, we want to create an environmental scorecard for our vendors that will be taken into consideration in future bids. Next slide. So I'm going to kind of walk through now our strategic sourcing process. And just so you know, really, my goal all the time is to put myself out of a job, right? I want all of our sourcing developers, sourcing managers to be doing all this work. So this slide goes through the process. What we've been trying to do is integrate EPP stuff into the process. And I'm just going to break it down for you. So a few years back, we started requiring those bid developer folks. The first thing that they do in a bid development process is to actually meet with the EPP program. And we identify EPP and climate opportunities, and we map out what's needed for the procurement. So the bid developer, they then document this in something called an EPP process and project plan. And this has to be signed by me or the EPP unit, and they put that document as a record in the procurement file. So we then work with our bid developers to integrate appropriate environmental and climate specification language into the bids themselves. And for those of you that work in procurement, this is one of the most important parts, getting those specifications in. So our sourcing teams, they're actually comprised of some of the larger public users of the contract and subject matter experts. And they're ultimately the decision maker on what EPP specifications will be accepted. So it's different than how Maryland has it set up. So I often describe kind of my role or our role as consultants to the team. So we conduct market research, we identify third-party certifications, we draft mandatory and or desirable specifications, and we present them to the sourcing team. And each contract is very different depending on what the product or service is. One of our contracts for environmentally preferable cleaning products has like 12 to 15 pages of EPP specifications. Others may not have any. So it's really, really contract specific. And in Massachusetts, we actually have another form that's included with all of our bids, the OSD bids. It's called the Environmental Practices Form. And the purpose of this form is to provide evaluation points to bidders who they foster and can substantiate a sustainable approach to conducting their own operations. And this form could actually determine whether a vendor gets an award or not, especially in a really competitive. So we assist the bid developers in evaluating this form and evaluating other EPP specification requirements. But one of the biggest issues I just want to point out, I've been talking about this so much, is in the area of for procurement programs. It's not easy to find and then purchase environmental and climate preferable products and services from contracts. So this is a really big focus area for us to make this process much easier. So we've been working closely with our bid development team to identify EPPs and catalogs. We've been exploring opportunities in our e-procurement system We've been discussing them in vendor onboarding and vendor reviews, and also in buyer kickoff meetings. And we've also developed an EPP products and services guide, and it helps buyers kind of navigate these products and trying to find them. So it's a real issue, and I think it's an international issue. It's all over. This is a huge issue. So once the vendors are awarded a bid, the contract is transferred to the contract manager, and we maintain a very good relationship with them as well. And as a condition of getting a contract with OSD, vendors are required to provide us quarterly sales reporting in an online system. It's called the Vendor Report Management System. We actually developed this system with a company called B2G Now. And we figured out how to integrate identification of environmental and climate preferable products and services into these reports. So the EPP program uses this data that's collected from the system to calculate metrics for our annual report. And I'll talk about this in a second. As for training, we've integrated some EPP and climate learning into our training, but we're really looking forward to doing something like what Maryland has done. They are really just, done a wonderful job in building a really great training program. So the other thing OSD has, we have a really good marketing, communications, and events program, and they put out publications, are beautiful publications and marketing pieces. So we work with them on a lot of these, and we always suggest articles that focus on sort of climate and environment for their newsletter that goes out to about 40,000 people every couple of months. All right, next slide. So one very important component of our EPP program is the use of eco-labels, and Chris talked about this a little bit, or environmental third-party certifications. So third-party certifications mean that the product or service has been independently reviewed and approved according to the criteria that's been developed for it. And third-party certifications are an enormous help to procurement staff because they kind of, in effect, they outsource the environmental review process for us, saving procurement staff an enormous amount of time. And, often procurement staff, they don't have the background to effectively review complex environmental information. So on this slide, there are some of the certifications and standards that we use in our contracts. All right, next slide. So now I'm just going to talk a little bit about reporting, my last thing. And I believe, just like with Maryland, one of the successes of the program is that we're able to report estimated spend on EPPs, tons of waste diverted, annual savings, reductions in metric tons of carbon equivalent. So these are all the sort of the high-level metrics that we report on, and leadership loves these numbers. So for those of you that do reporting, you know how labor-intensive this can be. I used to spend, 4 months out of the year going through all of our vendor reports to get this data. So I've been working for years, you can actually go to the next slide, for years to integrate EPP into our vendor report management system, as I said earlier, so that we're able to identify whether a product is an EPP or not. And with the help of AI and our incredible performance analytics team, we've been developing an EPP prediction model to determine very quickly if a product or service is an EPP or not. So we take this data from the vendor report management system and we use it, we put it into this Click software. It's a performance analytics software called Click, and it allows us to view the data in real time, slice and dice the data by buyer, contract, spend, you name it. And this allows us to track EPP purchases, to identify trends and targets, and to calculate EPP outputs and outcomes. So I'm super excited about this piece because I'm hoping it's going to free me up to do more spec development and research work. So I have one more slide. It's just links that may be of interest, but I don't know how I'm doing on time. I know I've been talking for a long time, but I'd love to talk for a minute or two about e-procurement systems if there is time.
Absolutely, positively.
Okay. So my main point about electronic procurement systems is that if your organization is implementing an electronic procurement system or e-procurement system, make sure that your environmental purchasing folks, whoever that is, that they're at the table for the development of that system. You want them at the table. You want to make sure that that system has the ability to show whether a product has a third-party certification or standard, that the certification can be verified with a unique URL, a link to prove that it meets the standard, to show post-consumer recycled content if applicable, and that the system has some filtering functionality. So allowing buyers to filter to find products that meet, certain certifications or standards or recycled content requirements or other types of environmental. So we commissioned a few years ago the Responsible Purchasing Network. They're a nonprofit that is really an expert in state sustainable procurement, to work with us to write a white paper called Environmental Claim Verification, Findings and Recommendations to OSD. And I'll post that link in the chat, the report, but this is an important document that really outlines the roadblocks and potentially some solutions for manufacturers, vendors, third-party certifiers, third-party certifier aggregators, e-procurement system providers, and states. So what we all need to consider to really help us with making it easier to find and purchase environmental and climate preferable products and services. So e-procurement systems really could play a very important role. All right, that's it for me.
So if I could, and thank you very much for that. It's very, very helpful, Julia. Can I ask you a quick question? Actually, for all the panelists here, ask you a quick question. So we have just a couple minutes left. So oftentimes I find that sorting out American political issues is actually easiest done if we don't talk about America at all. If we look abroad, okay? And environmental sustainability in the procurement world is actually a north-south issue in northern hemisphere versus southern hemisphere. So like, for example, when I talk to a room full of procurement officials, procurement experts in Italy, and half of them are from the south, let's say from sub-Saharan Africa, and half of them are from the north, from Europe, the Europeans will push environmental sustainability very hard. And the folks from the Southern Hemisphere just say, we don't care. We don't care about environmental sustainability. We have so many other problems in our countries. We just don't care about this environment. This is a European US issue. We don't care. How would you respond to that if someone said, we just don't care? We have so many other things we have to think about. We don't care about environmental sustainability. How would the three of you respond? Because you're in the middle of this battle on a day-to-day, week-to-week, month-to-month basis.
It's a very good question. Think about it for a minute. I don't know if either of you have an answer. But one thing I think that we try to do, and we copied Maryland on this, is to put out do a class on saving money using environmentally preferable products. And I think that can really cut across a lot of things, to sort of talk about how much savings you may have with certain types of products or services. So that's sort of one place that we've been able to have conversations with those folks that say, we don't care about this. And that will pique their interest.
Emily?
I'll give it a try, but I also really want to hear from Cary too. I think, in those that are impacted the most, will not have the resources to directly address this thing. And I think in government, we have an incredible opportunity to leverage our purchasing power. I mean, we have quite a bit of purchasing power in Maryland. I know Massachusetts has significant, it always has a great deal, even more than Maryland, to use it for good. And we should. I mean, if we want to think about what is our government doing for its people and its citizens, it's really truly the least that we can do is at least procure all of the things that we procure in a responsible and ethical way. So for me, I mean, it's absolutely the least we can do as governments for our people. We are using, most of us, taxpayer dollars to do this. And how are we going to, what values are leading the way there? And also, we hear all the time, I'm sure this is different politically, depending on where you're coming from, that, well, government is telling us what to do. Government is in our lives and telling us what to do. Well, we could at least look at ourselves, right? We could at least look at ourselves as government and lead the way and say, well, of course, our citizens should be doing the responsible and ethical thing. We are doing it. We are doing our best to put our money where our mouth is and do it ourselves.
Thank
Yeah.
you, Emily. I start by thinking about, the values that we've agreed upon. So we have a set of core values within the city of Portland. We've agreed upon the guiding principles of our sustainable procurement policy. And so that is the starting point. I have definitely faced that tension of, needing to get projects done yesterday and with the most cost-effective option possible. So we need to establish that we need to take that life cycle cost perspective and to acknowledge that sometimes the most cost-effective option now can exacerbate those issues and systems of oppression that we see now in a greater magnitude for the future.
Thank you. All those are excellent responses. I was really struck listening to the three of you that a lot of this is about leadership, and each of you leads in a different way, but you all three respond the same way, which is when you're asked a leadership question, why does this, how do we address those people who say it shouldn't matter, it just doesn't matter? The response from a leader's perspective, and you all did this really wonderfully, is start from principle, start from shared principles, and then move forward from there. So thank you all. We've run out of time for a really excellent session. And as again to the audience, the recording will be available on Public Procurement International. Thank the three of you for joining us, and thank the other panelists. I know Jelly Molino is listening too. Thank to everyone participating in this program. It's been a great summer series. Have a great rest of the summer. Take care.
Thank
Bye-bye.
you. Bye-bye.
Thank you.
Thank you so much.
Bye.